This morning we are continuing in our study of the book of Ecclesiastes, looking at the journal that Solomon has written concerning life and some of the observations that he has made with regarding to how we can live. Now, his journal has been quite interesting. I mean, we're beginning to understand some of his mindset as well as some of the methods that he is employing to pursue the different philosophies of life at that time. The philosophies back then were called a little different than what they're called today, but they're pretty much the same in terms of people being hedonistic or people following after money or vocation or fame. And what Solomon keeps telling us is that if we're going to try to live a life here on earth under the sun or apart from God, because that's what that means, under the sun or under heaven, we are going to continually come up feeling unfulfilled and unsatisfied. Now, that is especially true of non-believers, but it can also be true of those who are believers. The Apostle Paul talks about this in Corinthians when he addresses the issue of carnality. Carnality is when, as a Christian, we want to live our life according to our own desires. We don't allow Christ to be Lord of our life. And so we will find that these truths that Solomon is talking about, people living apart from God, can impact those who do have a personal relationship with God. They are going to heaven, but because they are trying to live the Christian life in their own power, or they're rebellious, or they just don't know how to live under the empowerment of the Holy Spirit, they will find that these realities that Solomon has seen to be true are also going to be true in their own life. You know, again, when you look at Solomon, and again, he is known for being a person of wisdom. It is interesting because here is this man, he's considered very wise, and yet for a certain segment of time in his life, he chooses to just throw self-control to the wind. He doesn't allow anything to restrain himself, and he just acts out the role, very unusual, of a man that is coming from the kind of religious heritage that he is coming from. Things that were once important to him are now viewed with cynicism. Especially the simplicity and the purity of having a walk with God. You know, really walking with God is not that complicated. I'm not saying it's easy, but it's not rocket science. You simply obey what God says, and blessings will be ours. Okay, it is simple, but it is a challenge, yes, because of our sin nature. But in Solomon's life, wisdom has taken a back seat as rebellion takes control, and he is continually finding that satisfaction is eluding him. And what that causes him to do is to run even faster down this path of destruction, or this path of emptiness. It's kind of funny how that works with us as human beings, human nature being what it is. You know, we just tend to run faster and faster down that path, you know, that we are losing our way in, thinking that somehow we're going to find the way, and we don't. And the interesting thing is that wisdom doesn't follow us. It refuses to keep pace with our maddening, frantic run to try to find fulfillment and satisfaction apart from God. You see, this story is repeated thousands, maybe probably hundreds of thousands of times every year by individuals. See, Solomon's journal is describing a life, as I mentioned, of living without God. And again, this has been his mindset, and it continues to be for most of the part. However, when we get to chapter 7, which is where we are at, halfway through his journal, things are becoming a little more into focus for Solomon, actually. You may have noticed that up till now, wisdom has been clearly absent. In the things that he has been talking about in his journal here, he doesn't talk about wisdom. But from here on out, you will find that Solomon uses the word wisdom or wise 35 times. No less than 35 times, depending on your translation. Well, why is that? Well, it's that way because I believe that Solomon is beginning to come home. He is kind of like the prodigal king. You remember the story in the New Testament Jesus told of the prodigal son? He takes his father's inheritance and he goes and squanders it, and we don't know how much time it was between when he left home and squandered all that money to where he finally begins to think and reason, you know. He's starving to death. He's lost the money. He's slopping pigs. I mean, that's, you know, something that any respectable Jew would not do back then. And yet, he eventually comes to the point of where he realizes he's made a miserable mistake, and he comes home. And Solomon is beginning down that journey. Now, again, he's still got a long ways to go, but at least he's made the turn in the right direction. Why? Because he's going to talk about responding wisely to adversity as well as prosperity. Well, let's look at the prodigal king. If you're taking notes there, point one. The prodigal king here. Now, perhaps maybe the best way to explain this change in Solomon's life is the writing style. You see, heretofore, he's been kind of writing in a narrative manner. But now he turns to a proverbial style. These brief, crisp, simple-sounding statements that offer insight into the handling of life and handling it in a successful way. And oftentimes, Proverbs and Scriptures, it comes in what is called a couplet form. And here he's going to do comparative, a couplet that compares things. Solomon is going to record 7 things that are better than their counterparts. And it has to do with helping us to get our focus back on needing to walk more closely with God. Let's look at the first one. Because remember, this is a series that we're doing here that has to do with planning a life that can be well lived. I don't care how old you are, you still need to be planning your life because you're still alive. And so what is it that we should be planning for? Well, one of the things that we should be planning for and working hard towards is having a good reputation. Point A, if you're following along in your notes. See, he says that a good reputation is more valuable than expensive perfume. I don't know, it's a little play on words that Solomon is using here in the Hebrew. But you could maybe put it in the vernacular today as saying that a good reputation is better than Polo, or it is better than Chanel. You know, we buy cologne and perfume because it's pleasant to smell and it's attractive in many ways. And so what Solomon is trying to say here is that a good name is even more important than pleasant aroma or even attracting others. That a good name has influence. You see, a good name's going to last a lot longer than the perfume or the cologne that we wear. That's going to fade away. But character behind a good reputation, that's going to last. And that's going to make an impact in life. Well, we know as Christians, that's what we're supposed to be doing. We're supposed to be impacting other people's lives with the gospel and with other biblical truth. We are to be leaving a place whether it's where we work or where we study or the community we live in, we should want to leave those areas better than when we first got there. I often would challenge the athletes at Penn State when I worked there on campus that you got 4 or 5 years here. What kind of difference are you going to make on campus? See, that's our calling as believers. That's wisdom. See, a good reputation is to be preferred over that which simply smells good and has a pleasant aroma. But it has more of an impact than just that, than perfume. Reputation, that concept, it affects other areas of our life. I mean, you're on a road trip. You're traveling somewhere in the United States that's unfamiliar to yourself. You're getting hungry. What do? Do you stop off at some greasy spoon that you've never eaten before? Probably not. Now, sometimes, you might want to be a little adventuresome and try it. But normally, where do you go? You go to the fast food chains that are reliable, or the restaurants that have a good reputation. Many years ago, I was on my way to Florida for a conference. Well, actually, it was a ministry. It was I was doing chapel services for the football team. They were at a bowl game. And out of Harrisburg, we stopped off at this Hardee's, and I had a chicken sandwich. And 2 hours later, I was sick. I mean, I am just puking my guts off on the side of the road. It was miserable. And for that whole week, in fact, I only got relief finally when I went to an urgent care down in Orlando and started getting some antibiotics. And I had to leave the bowl game. We were there for about a week, and then I had to go to another conference, and I was basically getting my strength back. But I'll tell you what, I have not been back to a Hardee's restaurant. And I will not go to a Hardee's restaurant because of that. Now, you may say that's a little unfair. Accidents do happen. But, reputation, it means something. It does have an impact on our lives. Well, we look at the next proverb, for example. And again, this did not originate in Western culture. Do you see that the latter part of verse 1? Solomon goes on to say this is point B. And the day you die is better than the day you were born. Now, isn't that encouraging? Yeah, does he need to take some Prozac? I mean, Solomon, what's wrong? What in the world? What are you talking about? Well, you see, in Western civilization, we have a tendency to celebrate birthdays, but we mourn death days. Well, how could one's death be better than one's birth? Well, maybe one way of trying to answer that is by looking in the New Testament. Looking at what Paul said. In Philippians 1, and in verses 23 through 24, Paul talks about this struggle that he has. He says, I'm torn between two desires. I desire to go and be with Christ, who's in heaven, which is going to be far better. And by the way, if you really understand the doctrine of heaven, you would see why Paul is struggling with wanting to go to be with the Lord versus being here on earth. But he says, but for your sake, for the Philippians and for other believers, it is better that I continue to live, so that he can continue to encourage them in their walk and disciple them and plant other churches. See, but both Paul and Solomon are saying that if they had it their way, they would much rather be in heaven, living there with the Lord rather than living here on earth. They would rather be there rather than with humanity. Again, the aspect here in terms of this statement is something that we need to ponder. We need to think about. So often we get so busy in our day in, day out activities that we forget about the eternal. Now, the next two comparative proverbs relate to the one that we've just looked at, for example. Point C, he continues. It continues to get, either more depressing or funnier. He says this, point C, he says, it's better to spend your time at funerals than at parties. Well, why? Because everyone dies. So the living should take this to heart. Now, that's the important part. You see, while we're alive, we should take the matters of eternity to heart. It is better to be at funerals rather than at parties. Maybe a better way of saying this is visiting a funeral home is better than gorging yourself at a banquet. Or maybe another way of saying it is this: a 30-minute walk through the cemetery is better than an entire afternoon at a block party, except for our block party. You need to be here for that one. But look, I mean, seriously, think about it. It's kind of sobering when you walk through a cemetery and you look at the things that are said on the tombstones about people and the fact that was once a living, breathing human being. And that someday that's where we're going to be. See, again, the aspect here is the matter of when we go to a funeral, it should be, and I know it's a little tougher for those that are maybe experiencing more closely the loss of a loved one, but for the rest of us, it should be a time for us to reflect, to think about our own mortality. And that someday we too will be in that casket. See, they used to say there's only two things that are true in life, death and taxes. Now, there's only one thing that's true in life, and that's death. Because if you don't want to pay taxes, you can go live in Alaska. And people do that. They don't pay taxes. They go off the grid. So the one thing that is true is that we're all going to die. And so funerals are meant to be, what Solomon is saying here, is a time to think. How shallow the places of entertainment seem to be in comparison to that which is eternal. And so he moves on. The next two proverbs belong together. Look what he says for point D. He says, sorrow is better than laughter. He talks about how sadness has a refining influence on us. A wise person thinks a lot about death, while a fool thinks only about having a good time. I can remember before I came to saving faith in Jesus Christ, contemplating these issues, the issue of death. I remember one social studies class I had, we talked about world events and a nuclear war was going to happen, and I began to wonder, well, what would happen to me if that nuclear war, am I going to die, and where am I going to spend eternity? And I remember when I almost died at an athletic competition, afterwards thinking about, wow, I have no idea what would happen to me if I should die. You see, what Solomon is saying here is that a wise person is going to think a lot about death, even a believer. And what is my life going to be like? See, what kind of legacy am I going to leave here on earth? What kind of legacy is PBC going to leave in this community? As we mentioned, we have an opportunity here to do something for the community that I think is significant. And believe me, it is. I shared this Wednesday night, but we had a business meeting at the firehouse on Tuesday, and the chief asked if I would give a few comments about what's going to be happening on September 15th. Well, I forgot. The only people that knew that we were doing this was the leadership team here and the leadership team at Paoli Fire Company, which was about 3 people. In other words, we hadn't announced it yet to the fire company that we were planning this outreach. So I began to share a little bit more about what we were doing. Make a long story short, when they found out that this church was willing to pay to have this kind of event and to raise money for them, there was this unrehearsed, spontaneous applause that came from the members of the company. They just couldn't believe that a church would be willing to do that. They're encouraged. So your witness means something. It's important. People are, and right now, even more so, paying attention because of what we said we were going to do. Well, again, that doesn't have a lot to do with death, but it has some kind of relevancy there, I'm sure, somewhere along the line there. The aspect of sorrow is better than laughter. Being serious about life, thinking about the legacy that we want to leave. We want to leave this community better than when we first got here and involved in the community, because that brings glory and honor to God. But sorrow is better than laughter. There's a true story that comes from the sinking of the Titanic. There was one woman that found her place on a lifeboat as the ship was going down. And just before they were to lower the lifeboat into the North Atlantic, she suddenly thought about something that she needed. And so she asked permission to return to her stateroom before they put the boat down. Well, she was granted 3 minutes, no more, because they were going to have to lower the boat down. And so she ran across the deck that was already listing, and she ran through the gambling room with all the money that had rolled to one side. And she came to her stateroom and quickly pushed aside the diamond rings, the expensive bracelets, and necklace, and she reached to the shelf above her head and grabbed 3 small oranges. Think about that. Seems incredible. Because 30 minutes earlier, she would not have chosen a crate of oranges over the jewels, the jewelry that she had. But one blast of the horn of the ship there, signifying that they were in trouble, that they were going down, and that which was valuable that now became worthless. And the worthless things became priceless. And in that moment, she preferred 3 small oranges over the diamonds, the jewels that she had that obviously were expensive. You see, death gives you that kind of wisdom. And those who have lived their lives suffering maybe from a terminal disease, they often demonstrate a remarkable degree of wisdom in how to live their lives. Worked with an athlete as a freshman, came to Penn State, was good, started his freshman year and all throughout his college career. Was able to get a pro contract, went into the NFL for a while. And the thing with this guy was that as a young believer, he would come to Bible study and he would like to play the devil's advocate. He was always asking these questions that really you kind of wanted to pull your hair out. Like, well, how many angels does it take to dance on the head of a pin? I was like, really? You're asking that and those kind of questions? I mean, come on. We're talking about some serious stuff here. But he just, he just had a knack of, well, he was rebellious. He didn't want to exactly walk with the Lord. And even though we met and he discipled, he was a slow progress until he contracted a disease that is incurable. And he only has a few years to live. And I'll tell you, what a turnaround in his attitude in terms of serving Christ. I mean, he is talking about Christ. He is witnessing. He is doing good things. He is going on missions trips. He is trying to live his life fully for the Lord. Why? Because he has faced. He's come face to face with the aspect that he is going to die. And he's going to have to stand before his Maker. And so he wants to make the most of his time. You see, sorrow sometimes has a way of making it better than laughter is. All the jokes and the fun that we have. Some of the jokes that you got to listen to, it's just shallow and it's not even funny. Sometimes it's okay to walk away from those jokes and just disgust. Well, wisdom also has a role in terms of point E, being criticized. It's better to be criticized by a wise person than to be praised by a fool. Now think about that. It is better to be criticized, especially by someone who loves you and is wiser, than those who maybe don't know you that well. And they're praising you, but they're foolish. See, a fool's laughter is quickly gone. It's like thorns crackling in a fire. And Solomon says, this also is meaningless. What does a foolish person's laughter sound like? Well, Solomon says it sounds like crackling thorn bushes in a fire. It's empty. It's kind of like a cackling, silly laughter of somebody who's foolish. There's nothing to it. It's that talking, that inside jokes that sometimes people have. Stupid things. It's like, okay, that's just, not even funny. It's just absurd. And it's futile. It's a waste of time. But hearing a wise person's rebuke is far better than that. A number of years ago, I was working with an athlete that showed great promise. As a freshman, he was wise beyond his years in terms of spiritual issues. He had a good foundation, was moving up in the ranks of leadership within our ministry. And I don't know, for some reason, his sophomore year, he decided he was going to take a spiritual hiatus. And so he stopped coming out to meetings. He stopped fulfilling his roles as a leader, even pulled away from the relationships that he had with other athletes in our work, in our ministry. Started dating a girl. She was a non-believer. And eventually, he was going to be engaged, and he wanted to marry her. And so the time came that I needed, some of the guys were saying, you need to talk to this guy. He's really going down the wrong path. And so I had a chance to get together with him. And it was one of the hardest conversations I've ever had to have with somebody in terms of their life and where they were going and what they were doing with it. And he didn't receive it well. And I lived about 3 miles off campus at that time, and I had gone and picked him up. I didn't want to meet with him anywhere on campus. I wanted a private area because I knew we were going to have to say some tough things. And like I said, he didn't receive it well. That drive back to campus was hard. Dead silence. I knew he wasn't happy about it. And didn't hear from him for about, maybe a year. And he called me up one time and he said, can you come visit me at work? I've got, I'm allowed to talk when I'm at work. And he said, I need to share with you some things. And so I did, went over and saw him. And he just, at that point, broke down and said, he'd made the biggest mistake of his life. He should have never walked away from the Lord. He should have never got engaged to this girl. And he asked for my help and Denise's help in terms of dealing with this situation. How can he get out of this, engagement and start walking with Christ? And slowly we began to work in his life to see it. It was hard. Wasn't easy. But oftentimes that's the occasion. Sometimes it takes the issue of pain and suffering to get our attention. But wisdom can return, and it did. And he got his life back together, and he ended up marrying a fine woman. He's in the ministry right now, having a very effective ministry as a pastor in central Pennsylvania. But it was hard. Coming to terms with that kind of reality means that we are going to be open, or should be open, to rebuke from those who love us and those who maybe are a little wiser. Well, there's Another aspect that Solomon talks about here that I think is important, and point F, the sixth couplet here, proverb, and that is, good starts don't guarantee great finishes. Good starts don't necessarily guarantee that you are going to finish the race of life, your Christian life, or the race there, as sometimes it is metaphorically seen as, in a great way. When I was a junior in high school, I had decided I wasn't going to go out for football that year. I was going to go out for cross country. I was a sprinter, and I thought, cross country, long distance running, no problem. I think I'll give that a shot. And so worked out that in the summer preseason, and I remember our first meet when the starter raised the pistol and he fired that pistol. I shot out like a cannon, and I mean, that's what sprinters do, right? That's how we run. You just boom, you go really fast. And I noticed that about the quarter mile mark, because in our course, which was about 2 miles and a quarter, I think high school at that time was the normal distance that you ran. Well, at the quarter mile mark, I was able to look over my shoulder and I saw, man, I am really out there. And I felt good. I felt strong. I felt loose. I felt great. Man, I just continued to run at that pace. At the half mile mark, I saw, man, I had extended it even further. But at about the 3/4 mile mark, I hit a wall. I mean, physically, I began to realize I was in some serious trouble. I was tired. I was winded, and I was beginning to slow the pace down. My stride became shorter and shorter, and at the mile mark, the number one man on the opposing team passed me, then the number one man on our team passed me, and for the next mile or so, people just began to pass me, and pass me. I finished in dead last. Came to the finish line literally heaving because I tried, but I just couldn't. I just ran the race wrong. There wasn't any time that we'd had as a team any discussions on how to run the race because all these guys were distance runners. I was the sprinter, and I guess it's just something I didn't think about. Well, we talked about it the following week, okay? And how you got to pace yourself, how you got to know yourself. And I was ready. That second meet, I was feeling good. I was feeling strong. I'm loose, and I'm ready to compete. And the starter fired that gun, and just like last week, I shot out of that start line, finish line like a cannon. And I got, I don't know, maybe 100 yards down, and there was this unrehearsed and spontaneous yelling from my teammates, "Slow down!" Oh, yeah. And I did. I slowed down and began to think, okay, I got to pace myself, and I finished in 4th place. Now, at that time, you always wanted to finish in the top 5 because the top 5 would give you points. You could help your team. One time or a couple times I finished as high as 3rd, but most of the time I settled in that area 4th and finish in 5th place. So you see, the valuable lesson I learned that even transcends into time is that good starts don't guarantee great finishes. You got to pace yourself. You got to be wise. You got to think. You got to strategize. That's what Solomon is saying. Oh, sometimes we sit back and we think, oh, if I could only go back and I don't know, raise my children differently, or if I could only go back and do this differently at work or that, or if I could have only majored in this rather than that. That's not the point. The point is to plan well where you're at right now. See, good starts don't guarantee great finishes. Thinking about the what-ifs and the could-haves, that's not where it's at either, you see. And so, again, these thoughts can kind of haunt us at times, but how much more we've got to look to God to be the one who can help us through this, as Solomon is trying to encourage us with. Now, lastly, he talks about something here that I think is probably one of the hardest things to deal with in our life, and that is the aspect of patience. How patience is better than pride. You see, that's what he says here. Patience is better than pride. Control your temper, for anger labels you a fool. Don't long for the good old days, for that's not wise. I think there are probably fewer things in life that we struggle with more than the issue of being patient. Am I right? And this is something that's a lifelong learning lesson for us. Now, hopefully we're becoming more and more patient, but probably if you are a normal human being, you will notice, you still struggle with it. I think of the needless moments that I have made a mess of things because I got ahead of God, or I thought I had a better way of dealing with things, or the times I've spent fuming in traffic. Well, it's silly because eventually all red lights turn green. Eventually you get there. Okay, maybe you're going to get there a few minutes later, but you still get there. Why do I get so worked up? See, Solomon's point, again, it goes deeper because he's talking about those hassles of life, the minor irritations, But notice the contrast. See, the contrast here is having a spirit of pride. See, how much better to be calm than angry? Because with a patient spirit, there emerges this opportunity for wisdom to work in our lives. But it can't if we're just going to be arrogant, if we're going to be closed-minded about it. See, we are on a pilgrimage from earth to heaven. And one of God's great goals is to develop His character in our lives. And He knows one of the best ways to do that is to try to teach us time and time again to be patient, to trust in His wisdom, to trust in His ways and not yours. But you see, an arrogant spirit, that's going to push wisdom aside. And it's going to result in us playing the part of a fool. And Solomon says, don't do that. That's not wise. Control your temper, verse 9. For anger is going to label you a fool. Wisdom is going to stay on the cutting edge. God is always up to date, and He is well able to sustain us through the tough and challenging times. And again, we just need to be aware of that. We also need to be aware of the fact that we can't be living in the past, to be nostalgic. I mean, that's what Solomon basically is saying here towards the end of verse 9. Don't long for the good old days. That's history. What happened in the past happened. Learn from it, apply it, but don't live in it. I think Jesus was the one who said, look, anyone who puts their hand to the plow and looks back is not worthy of the kingdom of God. We've got to be in the present and looking forward to the future. Yes, we can praise God for the past and the good things that He's done in our personal lives, or maybe the good things that He has done corporately. But we need to not long for yesterday. We need to be focused on today and what God has in store for us. Well, all of this talk about wisdom that he has brought out here in chapter 7 might lead us to begin to ask certain questions. Or even to wonder, well, why is wisdom so special? Well, there's a couple reasons that Solomon gives us, point 2, if you're following along your notes, as to why it is important. Again, he doesn't abruptly stop this section of his journal before explaining these two things. But it's almost like he's hoping, I think, to grab our attention in some way. See, look what he says in verse 11. He begins this way. He says, wisdom is even better when you have money. Think about that. Both are a benefit as you go through life. Wisdom and money can get you almost anything, but only wisdom can save your life. Except the way God does things, for who can straighten what He has made crooked? Enjoy prosperity while you can, but when hard times strike, realize that both come from God. Remember that nothing is certain in this life. Now, there's some wisdom here. You see, there's wisdom that comes, or that keeps our lives from the pitfalls of life. Point A, if you're following along. That's one of the takeaways from what Solomon has mentioned here in verses 11 through 14. Wisdom keeps our lives from the pitfalls of life. What do I mean? Well, again, go back over it and just think about this. He talks about money. He says, with money comes the pitfall of what? Pride. Yeah, that really does happen, doesn't it? You get more and more wealthier, and you begin to trust more in your money and not so much in God, and that's arrogance. See, but wisdom keeps us from that. Or maybe it's the aspect of affliction comes. And with that pitfall of affliction can sometimes come doubt. Is God really there? Is God really listening? God, why are you letting this happen to me? And so we begin to doubt God, His character, His goodness, or we become disillusioned in the Christian life. Well, there's so many hypocrites in the church today. That's why I don't go to church. Come on. There's so many hypocrites in wherever you're working, your neighborhood. I mean, come on. Oftentimes that's a smoke screen, but it is easy for us, I think, as Christians to become disillusioned in the Christian life if we don't have the right kind of perspective. Biblical wisdom helps keep us from that. Or maybe it's the anticipation of being vindicated for some injustice that has happened, or you're going to get a reward. You know that. The problem is that the pitfall is that there can be resentment and bitterness because you're not seeing that vindication. You're not seeing the reward right away. But wisdom, you see, keeps us from that bitterness and keeps us from that resentment because we know what God promises will be true. Secondly, Solomon, again, I think he's correct in what he says in terms of wisdom is protection, but it's more than that. See, wisdom also gives us divine perspective. Divine perspective. Think about where is God right now. Well, God is in the intermediate heaven. He's looking down. He's got everything, including our life, in perspective. Well, no, we don't, because we only see life from the horizontal and from the short period that we're alive. But God has the complete picture in mind. And so it's this, accepting the way that God does things, the way He works, that is important. And He's going to give us several opportunities in our life to basically be able to rely upon divine perspective. Look what He says. Accept the ways, verse 13, He says, accept the way God does things. Who can straighten what He has made crooked? Or who can bend what He has made straight? I mean, think about that. The Lord is ultimately in control. That's what Solomon is saying here. Students of the Bible call this divine sovereignty. God's in charge. And so if He straightens something, it's a waste of time on our part to try to bend it. Or if He's made something crooked, it's useless for us to try to straighten it. See, divine perspective, that's wisdom, is designed to replace resistance with relief. We need to understand that. And that's what biblical wisdom can do for us. And then, again, he says, and I love this, verse 14. He says, in the day of prosperity, what? Be happy. Be happy. Times are good. How would we say it today? Enjoy. Or party hardy. Again, just don't break laws of God's word, but yeah, enjoy, have fun. There's no reason to feel guilty because you're joyous or because you're enjoying the prosperity of this particular time in your life. See, divine perspective frees us up to be happy. But realize this, when hard times come, and they will come, realize that both prosperity as well as adversity comes from God. And so it's a matter of looking at things from an eternal view and realizing, God's ultimate design is nothing short of perfection. He's holy. And therefore, when He comes up with a plan, He always picks the best plan out of all the plans that could be picked. And so if we operate on that basis of wisdom, then we're not going to panic. We're not going to run. Or we're not going to stubbornly resist what He is commanding or what He is stating. See, again, the king failed to see God at work in his life. And this left him drifting through life, living a world of confusion and carnality and emptiness. Nothing satisfied, nothing fulfilled. In the absence of wisdom ushered in the presence of misery. It always does. And so Solomon is saying, and God is saying, don't be foolish. Learn from what Solomon has learned. Don't do as Solomon did, but rather do as he is saying here in terms of what he is leaving. When it comes to living life, there's a lot of things out there. The world is new, it's exciting. Yeah, there's some hard things, but it's kind of like birth. If you think about it. Birthing takes time, and it may require a painful process. But when it comes, you're amazed at how clearly things will come into focus with regards to life. You begin to feel like a new creation because you are. Maybe that's why Jesus said you must be born again spiritually, because He recognized the physical aspects and properties of this. As we look at what Solomon has been sharing with us this morning, the aspect of responding wisely to adversity as well as prosperity, how well are you doing in this area? Are you seeing that the wisdom of what Solomon is saying is really something that should be applied in your life? Take one of these principles that Solomon has mentioned and begin working on it in your own life. The 7 couplets there, the contrast that he gave, I'm sure each of us could take one of those and apply them to our personal walk with the Lord. Let's pray. Father, we come before you now this morning just thanking you for Solomon. Thanking you for what he has learned and how he's passing on this information that is so important. Thank you that he went through the misery. He went through the emptiness, the lack of satisfaction, so that we might not have to. Help us, Father, to be wise. Help us to choose to obey those things that you want us to obey. Father, we just pray that you would continue to have your way in our life. Thank you that we can draw close to you. Thank you that you love us and that you want us to be men and women that show forth your wisdom on a daily basis. Again, we'll be sure to give you the praise and glory because we ask this all in your Son's precious name. Amen. Dr. Stan, will you come forward and lead us in our closing hymn?